Muito bem-vindos, bem-vindas. Me apresentando, sou Kátia Roncada.
My name is Kátia Roncada. I am a white-skinned woman. I'm 47 years old. I have brown hair that's tied. I use glasses with a lilac color. I'm using a blue and green t-shirt, and on the back, there's a brown wall with a TV. I'm a federal judge. I'm a member of the Restorative Justice Commission, or a JUFI, and I help to conceive and organize this event. I will be facilitating the panels throughout this webinar. On this first moment, I'd like to inform that we will have translation during the whole event. We have the little globes signal on the bottom, and you can choose your language on the Zoom tool on the lower bar. For the audience, you can use the Q&A to make questions. That's also on the lower panel. We'd also like to inform participants that the access link for the event will be the same for all days. This event is being carried out by the Association of Federal Judges of Brazil, AJUFI, from Gallup University, Governor State University, Howard Zinn Institute, and Instituto João Clemente. We will begin the opening speeches of the event now. President of AJUFI, Eduardo André Brandão, from the President of Gallup University, Roberta Cordano, and the Counselor of the National Justice Council, Flávia Pessoa. President Eduardo André has been giving full support to the implementation and diffusion of restorative justice in federal justice, as well as promoting human rights, a long road that's already been constructed for many years. During his administration, the Committee for Restorative Justice was instituted, as well as a variety of projects that have been carried out. Beyond this, the small seed for a project that will be presented tomorrow also has a strong participation of AJUFI, because it starts with a campaign created by AJUFI in order to foment the development of a restorative justice project together with the João Clemente Institute. And that was the final push that was needed so that things would happen. So, with the floor, the President Eduardo André. Thank you, Kátia. It's a great honor for AJUFI to be here. I'm a 50-year-old man, white-skinned, with gray hair. I'm wearing a blue shirt, blue tie. I'm in a room where the wall looks like wood, and I'd like to highlight the excellent work that our committee has been doing, bringing new solutions, more humane solutions,
de aproximar, né, a vítima,
in the sense of bringing together both victims and those who commit the crimes, trying to change the standards that we have in relation to incarceration and other measures. I think it's very important that this relationship with people with disabilities, that's a very important theme. Their relationship between the federal justice and people with disabilities. There's a history for concession of benefits, especially of assistance for people with disability, that was always connected to the idea of incapacity. Starting over the last few years, we're trying to bring a different idea, going to a new reevaluation of these criteria. We've been knowing more and more the importance of how necessary it is to differentiate disabilities with capacity, changing this wrong conception in our beliefs. And that's a very important work to be done by federal justice, and that today it concerns all of us. All of us need to deal with this theme, disability, this in any sector of justice. So how can we insert people with disabilities in society, fomenting understanding? For us, it's very important to have an event like this, and we'll all need to be very aware of new ideas and new solutions. Thank you so much and have a great morning. Thank you so much, President Eduardo Andre. Next up, we have the President, Roberta Cordano. Roberta Cordano has become the 11th Dean or President of Gallaudet University in 2016. And she brought to the President's office all of her experience and the ability she developed both in traditional and non-traditional environments. Beyond Gallaudet, she was also the Vice Dean of the Ernst Welder Institution in Minnesota. And before her work in health, she was the Assistant President of the Hubert Humphrey Public Relations sector in the University of Minnesota, where she was also the Service Director for People with Disabilities in the Office of Multicultural and Academic Affairs, now known as the Office of Equity and Diversity. In these functions, she supported collaboration in all of the systems. She fostered innovation in order to strengthen access to higher learning for people with disability, as well as people from different ethnic and cultural communities. And she worked with the teaching body in order to structure and foster academic and administrative initiatives. With the floor, Roberta Cordano.
Well, I want to begin by first thanking everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you today. It is truly indeed an honor. And first, let me introduce myself. I am a white woman with, I would say, highlighted blonde, browned hair. I'm wearing maroon glasses, a black turtleneck, and a maroon suit. I am also middle-aged, and hopefully I look younger than my real age reveals. And with that, I want to thank everyone here for this wonderful topic that really sets an international precedent as it brings together notions of restorative justice and people with disabilities globally. I want to acknowledge and appreciate President Fernandez for his comments and leadership. Before I go any further with my comments, I wanted to take a moment to just acknowledge my joy of being among my legal colleagues here. My experience has been when lawyers and judges take the lead on an issue, we can see change in the world. And that has been my own experience working in Minnesota. I was actually part of a group of individuals who were working on providing access to our court systems for individuals who used multiple languages other than English. And as a leader who supported the access to spoken language through American Sign Language, we were able to use the legal underpinnings of the Americans with Disabilities Act in order to strengthen access that was provided then to all non-English language users in the state of Minnesota. I was able to help write the first ruling within our court systems in Minnesota requiring access for all non-English language users, including those using American Sign Language within our judicial system. And that ruling now is being adopted by many other states. And I say this as I sit here this morning with the recognition that in some ways was an act of restorative justice as we look to our language communities within our states and supporting them, and now as well other states in the United States. Clearly, this topic is vital, and I wanted to emphasize the importance of seeing your leadership, those of you coming from Brazil and other parts of the world. This is a conversation that people with disabilities are in much need of. I know that when we do well and we provide healing and access to individuals with disabilities, the world in turn will benefit. And so I join my colleagues in that belief. What is good for us, what benefits us, benefits everyone in the end. Here at Gallaudet University, we have an imperative for our university that brings together and infuses everything that we're doing around our strategic vision. And that imperative is called equity and belonging. The heart of that imperative brings us to the understanding that we have of the need for restorative justice, or now, as we see the term being used, restorative practices. Really infusing that in all of our actions within our organization, across the university, within our meetings and the relationships that we build, and our policies and policy decisions. We live in a world today where we see the need to find healing and pathways towards healing so that we can recognize what people may not be aware of or unconscious of, and how the systems and beliefs are so well entrenched within our country, within our governments, within our policies, and how they have shaped the understandings and believers of so many actions, individuals who had no understanding of the impact that these beliefs and systems would have on people with disabilities. The work of restorative justice is part of giving tools to individuals here in our nation and around the globe, tools to help us understand how to better listen and how to work differently. And more importantly, to do what I would call sitting in that zone of discomfort, in that zone of discomfort where people come to the realization of what they don't know, and perhaps understanding where misunderstandings may be in fact a reality. It's the power that comes through teaching and learning and growth within our families, within our communities, within our institutions like universities, our government systems, and throughout our country. And now, as we see happening even globally. I wanted to share with you this morning some thoughts about our conversation based on the learning that we've done here at Gallaudet and the conversations we've been involved with. Our Associate Provost, Tommy Horges, is here with me this morning, and I thank him for making the connection that allowed me to be here this morning, and I also want to recognize his leadership in this work. He as well is recognized as a deaf scholar and an academic leader here at our university. All of us here today have a good understanding of the shift that's been made for people with disabilities, shifting from a medical model to a social model. And that shift that's occurred has allowed us to begin to engage in conversations. Dr. Carol Hill, some time ago, I think in the 1980s, was one of the individuals who referenced this shift, as it is the beginning of our understanding of the need for different approaches to find solutions in order to make different kinds of decisions and develop different perspectives of what the problems are and how those problems are experienced. The idea is that the problems don't reside within the individual, but rather instead in systems, policies, rules, and beliefs. That was a fairly radical idea back in the early days of disability rights. We know that when we pay attention to systemic challenges, attitudinal challenges, information barriers, the greatest hope in doing that is to provide restorative justice for people with disabilities. So that shift that occurred to a new model has brought to us the language of restorative justice. And while we don't want to call it a label, it's more, I think, a system of beliefs and rules that help guide us in truly improving to create more effective adherence to social model perspectives in this world for the experiences of people with disabilities. I'd like to share some very specific examples as they relate to people with disabilities and in particular deaf individuals. Given that I'm president of Gallaudet University, it certainly makes sense that I would provide some examples within that context. The experience of deaf people around the world, and this has been the case for centuries, It's very often rooted in the unfortunate experience of being denied and rejected the use of their visual language. The oppression of the visual languages, sign languages, unfortunately continues to exist and continues to happen even to this day. The harm caused by that oppression, for any deaf person who uses sign language, they can speak to that harm. When people come to Gallaudet, they bring with them the traumatic experiences that they have related to that oppression. And this is true for myself. No one is exempt from this experience. And we understand this is based on fear and a lack of understanding and a lack of true appreciation of the experience of hearing loss. You know, I would love to share with you people and with people in general that it's interesting how we seem unwilling to be able to learn from our deaf children, because we know when they're born, their ability to adapt to the world is something that can be beneficial, instead of us trying to cure and fix them. It's ironic that the individuals who suffer most are very often those individuals who are older adults who have an onset of hearing loss. And strangely enough, that hearing loss is a part of the human condition, and it increases as an individual ages. And this is a phenomenon not just here in the United States, but around the world. What we know is that hearing loss is a near certainty for human beings. It's simply a part of the human experience. So what is it that we have lost is the ability to see the beautiful language that people who live with hearing loss have been able to use and what it can offer to the world. Sign language and visual languages are two examples of how much we have to offer to the world in terms of the ability that we have to adapt. In addition, there are so many restorative practices that you all have begun to work within the systems and judicial systems, which I am thrilled to understand. What we want to do more is understand how these practices can be applied to family systems, so that when you're doing the work of restorative justice and working to support people with disabilities, families can become a part of those solutions. So it's not children's or adults with disabilities who just need the healing. It's the families, the communities, the governments, and the nations. They are the ones who need to be engaged in inclusive conversations that would support the individuals who have disabilities' lives. You know, and I've been saying, and I could say so much with you here today. I have so many thoughts that I could share. But I did want to emphasize two very specific things from my own experiences here at Gallaudet University. We understand that restorative justice and restorative practices are the key to healing. This is true for every member of our community. When we engage in restorative justice and restorative practices, we create dialogues, learning, and as a result, growth happens. That then creates the potential for change within our community. The punitive approaches and systems of the past are effective on a much smaller scale for a small number of actions that are clear violations of norms that do require certain consequences. However, there are many other actions that have an impact on other individuals that are best resolved through the skills of developing listening skills and being able to use these skills to engage in conversations. We see that the framework of restorative justice and restorative practices work is really a framework that encourages learning and fosters the natural dispelling of myths that exist within communities. We recognize that when we do this work, it creates an opportunity to address the whole person and the whole person's experience in the world, not just focusing on a single disability, whether it be hearing loss or deafness or any other disability of any kind. We recognize that there are microaggressions that occur, and they will not change until we have these deep level conversations and do the deep or restorative practice, restorative justice work within our communities. We further recognize that the culture of restorative practices, restorative justice creates the opportunity to ask questions and to be curious. And that is the key to achieving a different justice and well-being for all of us in society. And finally, what I like about restorative practices, restorative justice approaches, is that they always provide us an opportunity to work to our strengths. They are gifts that we have to offer. And just to share with you an example, and I think this is true for many of you here, especially with those of you from Brazil, it's a very vibrant deaf community in Brazil, and so much is happening there that I'm so curious to learn more about. Much more is to be learned there. But I can tell you that we already estimate in the United States that our sign language economy, this economy is worth between $2 to $3 billion. And that's billions of dollars, in case you were wondering if you heard me right. If you think about the value that we as deaf people can bring to the American economy and how we are able to utilize our sign language and yet is so marginalized from the legal systems, from policies, from our medical and healthcare systems, from our educational systems, it's mind-boggling to see. Mind-boggling to see the contrast of what we can offer and yet the marginalization that occurs. And this is true, I'm sure, for your own countries, if you can investigate to understand what is the value that people with disabilities provide to your country's economy. These are natural gifts and ways of being that can be contributions to society. For me, as president of Gallaudet University, it is an imperative that we bring our value as we do, and therefore are deserving of the value of equity and equality within our country and within our nation. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Encantada com a sua fala, reitora.
We are delighted with your talk, Ms. Dean. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to listen to you. Now, we're going to listen to the Counselor of the National Council of Justice, Fábio Pessoa. The National Council of Justice is a public institution that used to improve the work of the judiciary system in Brazil, especially in what regards the control and transparency, the processual and administrative transparency. Fábio Pessoa, as a counselor, has a key role in this topic of human rights. She will be the representative of the National Council in the National Council of Human Rights and president of the Permanent Commission of Democratization and Improvement of Judiciary Services. Among many other works, she is a member of the Permanent Commission of the follow-up of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. I will hand the floor to the Councilor Flávia Pessoa. Good morning, all ladies, gentlemen. I'm happy to be here. I'm a white woman. I'm a middle-aged woman, have dark hair and black blouse. Behind me, there's a beige curtain. I'd like to salute all the authorities who are present here, everyone from the academia, the academic community, and I give my salute in the person of Dr. Roberta Ordano, president of Gallaudet, and Katia as the president of the organizer of this event. We're happy to be opening the first restorative justice seminar and persons with disabilities to discuss the restorative justice foundations and the action of this type of justice in the protection of the person with disabilities. The CNJ topic has a participation with the permanent work in the form of Article 2 in the resolution of 2010. The Democratization Commission has the role to propose studies that view the democratization and the access to justice, proposing actions and projects to the conduct of discrimination, prejudice, and other expressions of inequality from the physical and mental conditions and other values and rights protected that can compromise the ideals defended by the National Constitution of 1988. Also, we'd like to highlight that the national policy of the restorative justice is in the 225 resolution of CNJ as a goal of for the consolidation of the quality of restorative justice. With this effect, looking at the complexity of human relations created by conflict and violence, we should consider not only the aspects related to individual issues, but also the community and institutions, and also the social affairs that interfere in the context. So the terms of the resolution 285, restorative justice is constituted as an ordinated and systemic with techniques and activities to bring awareness on the relational factors and social factors that motivate conflict and violence, through which the conflicts they bring concrete or abstract damage. They are solved in a structured way, following the parameters that have been defined. Important to highlight the implementation of the national policy of restorative justice requires a universal, systemic, and institutional, interdisciplinary, intersectorial, and support action with the necessary articulation with other institutions, either public or private, having people from the civil society in their society group. With the participation of Gallaudet University in the promotion of the international seminar, with the presence of many specialists of different areas and countries. That will be a milestone in the evolution of the debates regarding this topic we are dealing here.
Muitíssimo obrigada, conselheira. Nós
Thank you
agradecemos.
so much, Counselor. We thank you very much. Now, for President Eduardo André, Roberto Cardano, the Dean of Gallaudet University, thank you all for being here with us, bringing so much light to our event. We are honored. Before we go into the panels, I would like to say that to me, it makes a lot of sense for us to be here together, thinking of restorative justice and inclusion of persons with disabilities. Restorative justice has its fundamental axis in relationships, proclaiming people to live based on their most dear values, respect, altruism, empathy, among others. In the search for the construction of a more fair, harmonic, inclusive living. That is, the strengthening of the community. And it happens through the idea that we are all co-responsible for this construction and for reaching such goals. Restorative justice is not based only in laws, but in something much deeper, in our humanizing values. And in a very summarized way to conceptualize it, allows us to identify linking points with the topic of the persons with disabilities, as we search for the acceptance of all people with or without the disabilities, building such an inclusive world that the barriers that prevent the persons with disability to have access to be overcome. And then we will only talk about people who are totally embraced, welcomed, and belonging to the community, regardless their nature or difference. We are all different somehow. Diversity is something innate to human beings. And believe me, I believe firmly that the breaking of these barriers has to do with knowledge, the knowledge of the needs of the other person, and especially of all their strengths, all their greatness. Therefore, we're going to have now the panel, Restorative Justice, Theoretical Foundations. We're going to have as panelists Professor of the Center of Justice and Peace Building of Eastern Mennonite University, Tariq Maserani, the Judge of São Paulo State of Court of Justice, member of the Managing Committee of Restorative Justice, Marcelo Salmaso, with the work in the protection of the community with hearing impairments, Najma Johnson, and the senior lecturer of Singapore University, has a PhD in restorative justice, Oswana Begum. Now we hand the floor to Professor Tariq.
Thank you very much, Judge Katya Rampada. Greetings, everyone. My name is Tariq Maserani. So I'm a white-skinned male, my early 40s. I'm wearing glasses. I have blonde hair and a tan button-up shirt, white background with a framed picture of a waterfall, a photo of a waterfall behind me. I'm going to be speaking about some of the conceptual pieces of restorative justice with the assumption that there are some folks in the audience here today that may not be so familiar, and then also say a few words about my own experiences at the intersection of restorative justice and disability. So to begin, I'm going to share my screen here, and what I'm showing is a slide that has a scene of a starry sky with one individual looking up at the sky. And the quote on this slide is, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." It's a quote by Albert Einstein. And there's an orange circle with the words paradigm shift above the quote. I give you this visual and the quote with it to emphasize how radically different restorative justice is from much of what we have come to consider normal. Whether it is in the family systems, dynamics that we grew up in, whether it is in the school systems where we learned in, the workplaces where we work, whether it is in the public spaces, the political and social spaces that we move through. In all of these spaces, we have come to be surrounded by, to a large extent, a retributive approach to human relations. It's an approach that lends itself to punishment when we believe others deserve harm because they are in some ways less worthy. And when we do not care about the relationships as much as we care about the outcomes we want from a particular process. Now, shifting paradigms from one way of seeing the world to another is both hard, but in this case also can come with some ease, because I do believe that the paradigm that restorative justice offers is something that resonates deeply with us, as something that aligns with the natural qualities that humans have to be in relationship with each other as social animals. But certainly it's also difficult. It's difficult to unlearn the patterns with which we interpret the world, patterns with which we act out in the world. And so in this conference and in our lives beyond, I hope we can start to become aware of those patterns, and we can start to see how there's a different way of even seeing some of the most fundamental aspects of our life. I'm going to show you this slide here, which gives you some elements of that paradigm shift. These are not the only ones, but these are the ones that I would like to highlight. So on this slide, which is on a kind of tan matted background, it says paradigm shift up top. And there are two series of boxes. One series of boxes on the left under the label Retributive Justice, and one series of boxes on the right labeled Restorative Justice. There are arrows leading from the Retributive Justice boxes to the Restorative Justice boxes, representing the shift from one paradigm to another. So I want to begin with the first one, which talks about what we consider the strongest human drive, the strongest motivating factor. And within a retributive justice framework, that is presumed to be fear. It is presumed to be the desire to avoid consequences. And as the strongest motivating drive, we use fear. We impose consequences in order to change human behavior. You may be able to relate to this through the way parenting has been experienced, and how you change the behavior of a child is through the threat or the imposition of consequences, the fear of withholding love to a child. And that is seen as an effective way of parenting. Of course, that same logic is how the criminal system also operates to a large extent. That same logic is how the schooling disciplinary systems operate. A shift in paradigm to restorative justice means that we start to recognize that there is another drive within humans that deserves attention. And that is the drive to be in right relationship with one another. That is the drive, we could call it the empathic impulse that people have to care for each other. Now we know this exists because we feel it in ourselves with certain people in our lives. We feel it strongly, and it often results in a sense of giving, a sense of grace and forgiving for those that we have empathy towards. What I would suggest is that this human drive is not limited to just certain people, but rather it is blocked from certain people and certain groups. And restorative justice creates the spaces where that empathic impulse can flow towards others who we may not otherwise consider ourselves in relationship with. I want to move on to the next box on the retributive justice side that says humans are independent beings that can be understood in isolation. So again, this is an assumption within the traditional retributive mindset that each individual is on this earth as an independent being. They make their own decisions based on their own thoughts. Even what they learn, they kind of consume with choice. And what they do can be understood just by looking at them. Who they are can be understood just by looking at the individual. And this is how we have whole frameworks that focus on the individual as the unit of analysis. Whether it's economic theories that look at individuals as consumers, political theories that look at individuals as voters, theories in psychology and psychiatry that look at individuals. The shift here is to a recognition that humans are deeply interdependent beings, and that they can only fully be understood in the context of community. That what humans do, what humans are, can only be understood by looking at the relationships they are in with others around them. Relationships that form them, that inform them. Relationships also that mean that all actions that humans have also affect others. We're starting to understand how human nervous systems attune to each other, even without words. Our emotional states affect the emotional states of others around us. We are deeply independent, not just materially, but even emotionally. The third box looks at offenses under the retributive justice paradigm as individual violations of laws or rules. In other words, the thing that society needs to avoid through its court systems, through its disciplinary rules, are violations of laws or rules. These are laws or rules that are oftentimes abstracted away from any given circumstances. They're laws or rules that were created by people and at a time that are oftentimes disconnected from the actual people involved in the incidents. They're laws and rules that oftentimes come with a credentialed or group of experts who are needed to interpret the laws or rules and to apply them. Shifting the paradigm to restorative justice, we speak not of laws or rules that have been violated, but we speak of acts of harm that are experienced by individuals. They're not defined by legislature, by policymakers, by school heads. They're defined in conversation with the people who are experiencing the harm. And they also, as acts of harm, arise from not just individual actions, but the actions and systems in the community. And they in turn affect those relationships in the community. The last box is on the
Então, a
retributive.
última caixa
Accountability is through a
tem a
process
ver
in
com
which
responsabilização. No lado da justiça restributiva,
I'm hearing another voice. I'm not sure what to do. So I'll just wrap up by saying the accountability in the last box in the retributive justice system is seen as a process in which authorities, those specialized elites, determine guilt and impose punishment. It's an external process onto the individual. Shifting the paradigm to restorative justice, accountability is seen as an internal process, that the person who has done harm comes to an understanding of the harm they have done, acknowledging that harm, that those actions and their impacts, and then desiring to repair that harm out of that drive to be in right relationship. So accountability is redefined from an external force to an internal process. I'm going to stop my share there and hand it over to the next speaker. Marcelo, I think it's you.
Ok. Olá, muito boa tarde a todas e todos.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcelo Salmazo. I am a man with light skin. I have brown hair. They're gelled. I use a short beard. I have brown eyes. I'm using a gamer headphone. I also am using a suit, a blue suit, also a tie, and I have a painting with that was made by students from public school here in Brazil. So first, I'd like to say that I'm very happy to be here in the space talking about restorative justice and persons with disability, with brings us back to a very deep discussion about individual and collective responsibilities, about equality and social justice, and also brings us to a discussion about forms of violence and all their manifestations, structural violences, symbolic, cultural violences, beyond only physical and psychic violence. And due to this, I'd like to deeply thank everyone for this space and also to everyone who participated in the organization. I'd like to thank the president of the Association of Federal Judges, Eduardo André. I'd also like to thank the president of Gallaudet University, Roberta, who was here with us, Councilor Flavia Pessoa, and everyone who organized this event and made this possible, and who represent the institutions that are involved in the organization of this event. And I'd like to bring great thanks to Professor Jean Salm, who is a good friend of mine and who's been fundamental in the building of the restorative justice policies here in Brazil, not only in the state of São Paulo, but all over Brazil. And he has also been building bridges between Brazil and everyone around the world that works with deep quality restorative justice and that is understood as a community construction. I'd also like to thank Federal Judge Katia Roncada, a great friend of mine, my colleague. She's also a part of the management committee of the Restorative Justice Committee of the National Justice Council. And I'd like to congratulate Katia Roncada and João Salm for the idea they had and for the organization of this event. And I'd like to begin my speech by saying that the first time that I had contact with restorative justice, I was sure that I was going to find a very powerful instrument for the change of the world. And in this path in restorative justice for almost 10 years now, I understood that restorative justice, before everything, changed me. Restorative justice, as Professor John Solomon always says, is an invitation to each and every one of us for us to understand our responsibility with ourselves, our responsibility with others, and our responsibility with the environment we are inserted in. Even because it's a great illusion for us to believe that we can change others, especially through the logic of fear and punishment. I like to say that I can send someone 10 times to jail. That person is only going to transform from the moment in which they find something that makes sense to them, that touches their subjective self and brings them to a transformation from inside out. So restorative justice transforms us. And based on our transformations, we can inspire other people to their own transformations. And so they can transform themselves and their social contexts in the sense of building a fairer society, a more humane society. The Justice Court of the state of Sao Paulo, especially based on the action of Judge Egimberto Menido, who will be here in this seminar, who is our great leader in restorative justice here in the state of Sao Paulo, the one that inspires us in this long path. He's had a pioneering action in the construction of restorative justice in Brazil. And from the very beginning, in partnership with other sectors of the community, always understanding that restorative justice is built inside communities, with communities, by communities, for communities, especially close to the education system. Here in the state of Sao Paulo, we understand restorative justice as something that goes way beyond regular conflict resolution methods. Yes, restorative justice has a lot of different conflict resolution methods, but it goes beyond this. We understand restorative justice as a paradigm shift in the way that we live socially, live with each other, because our structure of conviviality, we have a structure of great social injustice here in Brazil that's based on a Cartesian mechanicist paradigm that brought to social living the directives of individualism, consumerism, utilitarianism, and exclusion. And these directives reduce us as complex human beings, multidimensional human beings. This is another idea that's very developed by João Salm. So these directives of exclusion, utilitarianism, consumerism, and individualism reduce us to places where we seek power and income so that we can be consumers in a society where being equals having and having equals being. So it's a social living system that's formatted based on hierarchy, in which certain groups feel like they have a certain right to dominate other groups of people, which they effectively do. So it's a social structure that imposes so many violences to persons.
Obrigado. Uma estrutura de convivência social, portanto,
A structure of social living that imposes violences to a lot of people and groups of people, not only physical and psychic violence, but structural violence, because it denies people and groups of people from having access to goods and resources which should be available to everyone, and also violence of a cultural type, because it denies people the network of relationships that guarantees social welfare. And so these violences especially hit people in groups of people who are identified by their skin color, their social origins, their sexual option, their religious option, and also persons with disabilities, to coming into the theme of this seminar now. And so, as an example, we can just look at our sidewalks, our buildings, both our public and private buildings.
de acessibilidade às pessoas com deficiência, né? Como existe uma
The
violência
lack of accessibility that we have, and how we have a architectural violence, and we have just a few examples out of so many different violences that we have. So we're inserted in a structure of social violence that creates non-belonging, that creates exclusion, and that creates violence with so many people and groups of people, which creates pain, suffering, humiliation, shame, because oftentimes it makes it so people respond to this violence in a violent manner as well, and violence against themselves as well. So we have people who are depressed people who are sick because of this violence or because of violence against other people. And the way in which we as a society deal with this violence is either based on treating symptoms in a very superficial way or based on a punitive system, a system which is also violent and therefore makes a feedback loop with this violent system. And so a restorative justice, it comes in not only as a conflict resolution method, as I said, it comes in together with a new paradigm and as an instrument for the implementation of this new paradigm. It arrives together with this holistic ecological paradigm that is not just based on individualism. It's a paradigm that's holistic, a paradigm that is relational in its basis. It understands that all of us human beings are interconnected amongst ourselves and with the environment in which we are inserted. Therefore, we say once again that restorative justice is a proposal for the paradigm of social living so that we can go beyond the directives of individualism, exclusion, consumerism. These are directives that foster war of everyone against everyone competition so that we can build new relationships based on other guidelines, other directives, the guidelines of tolerance, dialogue, horizontal and collective construction, damage reparation, the construction of individual responsibilities and co-responsibilities that are collective so that we can bring in the logic of cooperation and care, as Professor Elizabeth Elliot well said, because when human beings take care of themselves and of others and of the environment, they tend to cause less damage. And in this sense, I'd like to say that restorative justice is an instrument of social transformation. And so that it is an instrument of social transformation, it needs to work in these three dimensions of co-living and the three dimensions of conflict: relational, institutional, and social dimensions. So Resolution 225 of 2016, made by the National Justice Committee, defines restorative justice as a set of orders and rules, principles, practices, and actions that seek to raise awareness on relational, institutional, and social factors that motivate conflicts and violence. It defines restorative justice as something that goes way beyond conflict resolution methods, as a true change in the paradigm shift. This resolution today is the institutional framework for restorative justice in Brazil.
Dimensão relacional, nós estamos falando de dois aspectos. O primeiro deles, as nossas próprias transformações, porque as
Our
mudanças
own transformations, for us to understand what are our beliefs, our influences, our story. And then from this, we can reflect on how we are small gears that in our professional and personal actions, we make this huge machine of violence work. So we can transform ourselves and become effectively agents of peace construction. And here, still in the relational dimension, we're talking about the methods for conflict resolution of the restorative justice, which involve not only the one who suffered the damage, but their families. And also the community that was directly or indirectly affected. The public and private institutions that are a network of insurance of rights to work with individual responsibility, but at the same time, collective responsibilities. The one who caused the damage not do it alone. It's a series of failures from this person's family, from the public power, and the community as a whole. Also, the restorative justice works in an institutional dimension, because our institutions, they are a mirror of the social structure. They are hierarchical, they are punitive, and they are excludent, the institutions. And the institutions, they many times they bring tension to the relationships, and the persons who suffer the violence within the institutions, they are in tense relationships, and they many times they respond with violence to themselves or to the others. So when we talk about restorative justice in an institution, we need to invite the institution to rethink their co-living environments, the way that they live with each other. And just to wrap up my talk, the restorative justice also works in a social dimension, understanding that the restorative justice is built in the community, for the community, with the community, and towards the community. So we tell that when a judge wants to implement restorative justice in their community, they have a new way to look at justice, a new way to look at the community, because this person is also part of the community where he or she works. So they invite the partners of the community, public institutions, private institutions, non-formal organizations, the whole society, to build this collective foundation on which the restorative justice will be built, with all the structures and the spaces. And it is really key for us to have this idea of co-responsibility in the community and the action of the restorative justice in the community. It is the essence of this type of justice. The judges, they don't not understand that the restorative justice belongs to them, but it is a construction of all. It is in the reasoning of co-responsibility. So the restorative justice will not be disguised judging, and the essence of this approach can be preserved. The base of the restorative justice, they will participate in the practice and provide support to the restorative methods, but also it will work in the factors that are motivating violence, especially the factors that promote violence against the most vulnerable groups, among them the groups of people with disabilities. And then I'll finish my talk and I hand the floor to the next speaker.
Professora
Professora
Naima?
Kátia,
So are you all ready for me to
Najma?
begin? This is Najma. Okay, so all are ready for me to begin? Okay, good morning, everyone. I am Najma Johnson. I am a Black person, masculine looking. I have short hair and glasses. My background is light gray. I have a blue sweater, and I am middle-aged. I grew up with restorative justice. I grew up in the Black community, living in the church, Black organizations, and our street was always very restorative justice focused. However, my community was all hearing, and I am a deafblind individual. So until I was 20 years old, I began to see that restorative justice was really dependent on the spoken language. So on the auditory realm, and that was not accessible to me. So I started working at Dawn. Dawn is an organization that provides services to deaf people with all sorts of experiences and mainly domestic violence. So many survivors have wanted to have shared what they really need and what their goal is. So the power is in having the survivor really say what they need to heal. So there is no one standard practice. We're looking at all survivors of sexual violence, of any kinds of violence, and we are wanting a harm reduction approach so that those who are harmed can heal and those who have done the harm can be held accountable. Our goal is to stop the trauma and stop the pain. And we recognize that trauma often is exacerbated and built upon and perpetuated. So our community is deaf and deafblind. And because we have a disability and because we have so many other issues that come with that, that has been multiplied. Our trauma has been multiplied. So deaf people and deafblind people are also victims of language deprivation. Language deprivation is also a crime, and it is the withholding of a natural language. So for the first 7 years of life, that is the critical period for learning language. And when families do not know that their children are deaf, or they don't know how to give their deaf children language, or for whatever reason, our deaf families or deaf kids are not exposed to language. And so they never have natural access to a language. And language deprivation has an enormous psychological impact. So we have deaf people who are surviving not only the trauma and horrible experiences, but also language deprivation. So this causes a lot of harm, and oftentimes survivors who have experienced all these different multitudes of harm end up also harming others in their environment, or when we try to support them and we end up harming them more when we try to help them, and we end up wanting to fix it. And instead of stopping the harm, we are exacerbating it. So it becomes very dangerous when we end up perpetuating that cycle without even realizing it. And this creates a very negative impact. Restorative justice really maintains people's humanity without being a punitive system. It creates accountability. So the punitive system creates a loop of continuous traumatizing experiences. those experiences deteriorate the ability to address and understand the harm that has happened. For the deaf community, and I'll just say that the deaf community is very, very small. The harm doer may be assumed to be defiant because they don't have access to respond and to auditory information. We may think that because they are using their voice and hearing people may not understand, that they seem belligerent, and they're not. Oftentimes hearing people will see their gestures and think that they're being defiant or belligerent, and it's really intensifying the trauma that they've experienced. So photocentrism, as well as autism and oddvidism, are all create violence. So photocentrism refers to how our society systemically disseminates information with people, hearing people in mind. So based on auditory means, without regard for those who depend on visual means or other means. So information is shared based on the auditory means, which means those who are deaf or deafblind do not get that information and end up in trouble. Autism refers to the social dominance system that is based on the ability to hear. So if there are people who are hard of hearing and may hear a little bit, the general community will tend towards supporting them. Oddvism refers to information that is disseminated based on sight and hearing. So somebody who is blind or deafblind may miss that information. So somebody who's deaf may depend on, may miss the information that's shared auditorily. Somebody who's blind will miss the information that's shared through sight. And we have members that are both deaf and blind who miss both ways. So a deaf person who has been harmed or may have caused harm often misses the opportunity to even understand what's happening in their environment. And even if they would like to access a system of restorative justice, they're often unable to because of the lack of access. Because of trauma, because of language deprivation, there is, even with interpreters, the potential for mistranslation, which then can cause even more harm. In addition, deaf people don't know if the interpreter has done them justice or not. They have no access to the source language to know whether the interpretation is accurate. And oftentimes in their most vulnerable moment, harm is perpetuated. So there is great potential for information to be lost and to not be communicated. And the cycle continues. So again, oftentimes a deaf person who has harmed or has caused harm will be harmed yet again when they come in contact with the police. And restorative justice is so critical so that it can stop the cycle of violence, sexism, racism, audism, photocentrism, odd-centrism, or oddvism, so that all those cycles of violence can be stopped. Once we break the cycles of violence, we can hold people accountable, we can reduce the harm, we can provide access, we can meet the needs of specific communities. We can also then sit down and define harm. We can empower people to speak up for themselves and fight for themselves. We can share information that may have been missing and not communicated or miscommunicated. So stopping the violence, stopping the cycle of harm, providing support, providing a harm-free environment, a trauma-free environment, a trauma-informed response. We can stop audism, oddvism, sexism, racism. We can be anti-ableism, anti-racism. We can have a restorative justice approach. Our work is based on cultural needs, linguistic needs, safety needs. And again, our community is very small. And the response needs to be intentional. And we do have restorative justice practices in very small places, but we need to bring it into academia. We need to make it accessible. And we need to make sure that the general community has access just as we here in academia or places like this do. So thank you very much for your time.
Morning, everyone. I believe I'm the next speaker. Am I right, Tariq? Yeah. So good morning. I am from Singapore. It's 10:35 p.m. So it's late in the evening. I am very, very pleased to be in this session and to be part of this first ever discussion on restorative justice and disabilities. I would like to share my slides, maybe give you a little bit of a background in terms of where I can contribute to this discussion. However, my stories may be a little different from what everyone else have shared so far. So first, let me begin by sharing my slides. Okay, so I believe everyone started off with an introduction of themselves. So as you can see, I'm a Muslim person. I've come from Singapore. My family originally are from India. I was born in Malaysia, I'm involved in this session because I have Professor Sam who has kindly invited me to be part of this. So I'm really, really very glad and very happy to be to be able to speak at this gathering. So let me just begin by sharing a little bit about myself. I thought this was important because as we were trying to communicate via email with my fellow panelists, I think a lot of us were not very sure about how we're going to be sharing, what we know. And I think we wanted to give everyone an overview of what restorative justice is, the principles and the values, and also, to provide an overview of what we can discuss tomorrow when we talk in detail, in depth about the use of restorative justice and practices in the area of disabilities. So maybe very quick introduction of myself. I studied law, but I worked predominantly in the social services. I have a very unique situation where I was born in Malaysia, but I had no citizenship. I was stateless until I became a Singaporean about 10 years ago. So for a long period of time, I had no citizenship, and that kind of prevented me from being a lawyer or working in the legal field. But I was lucky to be able to work for the Singapore government and for me to be able to be a social worker. So because of my legal background, I went on to be a probation officer, and from there I learned about restorative justice when I was doing my master's in law, and I realized, of course, this concept is very unique and new to Singapore. But then I realized over time, it is also very much connected to the culture that we have here, the religion and the principles and the practices within the Chinese communities, the Muslim communities as well. It's a lot of it is can be seen from the practices of the traditional conflict resolution methodology. So moving on, as I was trying to prepare for this presentation, I was thinking about the work that I've done on the ground before I share a little bit about the values and the principles of restorative justice. So as Najma was highlighting earlier, in terms of when we look at inclusivity, we do see people with disabilities sometimes being represented, not overly represented, but being represented in the criminal justice system. So sometimes they come in as perpetrators. Most of the time they are perpetrators, and they are perpetrators with not just physical disabilities, but sometimes they also have mental health issues, and then they commit offenses. And when that happens, then what do we do, right? Do we treat them in the same manner as how we would treat able-bodied, person, or do we provide them with differentiated treatment and option? Obviously, they have committed an offense. So in this case that I worked with, it was a young boy. What happened here was he went on to get into a conflict with his brother, who was having multiple mental health issues. So the brother was not in his right frame of mind. He was harming this boy repeatedly since the boy was 10 years old. And this one day, things just went very bad, and this boy got really upset and angry, and he kind of hit the brother to the extent where the brother died. So the brother who died, the victim in this case, was someone with disabilities. But the boy, because he was young, we were wondering what to do with it. Singapore has got very strict rules and law, and we were not sure whether there would be any option for him to be given probation. And probation here is, there's no prison term at all, and he doesn't have a record when he completes probation. Because the boy has got no delinquent traits, I would say. He is a completely socially responsible young person. He was in school, he had no bad habits, he was doing very well. But the situation was, he was provoked, he was upset, he was angry, and he was basically defending himself. That's what the father told me. So the parents came to me, and when I was doing the interview, it was very difficult because the mother was upset. The mother was saying, yes, I have one son, I had to bury him, but I have another son who is in prison. You have to help me, and you have to give him a chance. So this kind of made me realize that sometimes we would also, obviously, we do have a situation where we need to look into restoring how we could, put a balance with this family. And this is the father's statement, right? The father was saying that my son's death was a tragedy nobody wanted, and the son was not well, and he said that life must go on, right? And he really wanted his younger son to come out of prison and to be at home. And he was given probation. He completed probation successfully. So I think one of the things that I realized in my many engagements, so that was very unique. We rarely would have a case where the victim has passed on and the perpetrator was given community-based sentence, right? This is going to cause a lot of what we call the optics, right? The public is not going to be happy. They're going to say, why are we giving this kind of outcome and all that? But I remembered in my many years working with the judges, people like Mr. Marcelo here would understand, they play a key role in terms of how we could make certain changes as well. So this was something a high court judge told me. He said, sometimes, yes, we need deterrence. We do not want siblings to fight and kill one another. Obviously, we do not want that. We want to send a clear message that offending is wrong, but at the same time, we should not sacrifice a young person at the altar of deterrence. So deterrence is one aspect, but if we can do the restoration, why not do the restoration? Obviously, we don't articulate it in that way. The judges try, to use therapeutic justice, but because of our system, we have out of 10, maybe one, right, who would say this. But this is something that I remembered when an appeal went by the prosecutors appealed, and this is what the judge told the prosecutor, right? No, we are going to let this person be given probation, and we're not going to sacrifice the person at the altar of deterrence. So moving on, looking at our topic and what we are trying to get at here, I being a social worker myself, obviously the 20 years I spent in the social services required me to get a qualification in the social work service. So Mary Parker Follett is a very famous American who fought for the rights of children. And I think one of the things that she highlighted here resonates very well with me. And she says here that it is really how we integrate the differences and not annihilate or absorb. We should not hide the differences. We should not, keep them away from the larger society. So this is the concept of how we bring in inclusion within the society, and what can we do as members of the society to bring this inclusion. So obviously in the case of working with offenders, as I mentioned, there's perpetrators and victims. Both of them could be suffering from some sort of disabilities. What do we do in providing a holistic assessment? And what can we do as probation officers, as teachers, as social workers, as judges, and now, I work in the academia now, and I teach young social workers, and I tell them, look, you cannot be just reading what has happened in the papers, in the media. Obviously it looks really bad, but you must go to the bottom and find out what is the underlying cause and what can you do to help, right? So I think this is really key. How can we integrate the differences? And I think this is where the whole concept of relationship comes in. So I'm obviously sharing my experiences from Singapore. So this is something one of the presiding judge highlighted in our work plan 2 years ago, 2019. And as you can see from the quote here, he talks about how in disputes, any kind of disputes, we have is because of deteriorating or broken relationship. And restoration is the underlying, key in terms of how we could do this. And if we can do this at an earlier stage, right? How can we prevent disputes and prevent conflict? And this is really, I like what he said at the end. This is really about putting a fence at the top of the cliff, right, to prevent the person from falling off the cliff, rather than placing an ambulance at the bottom of the valley. So it's really about what can we do to be preventive, to be inclusive, and the model between restorative, the model behind restorative justice provides us with that opportunity. And I think three of my fellow panelists earlier has already highlighted that. I remember Marcelo saying restorative justice can change the world, right? Yes, so this is what I think he was trying to say. What can we do in terms of relationship? So moving on, I obviously went on to do my research studies, and it's in a totally different context. I looked at company law and business ethics and companies that kill people with their products, and I was looking at restorative justice. But I found 4 values that I thought was really important in the leaders that I interviewed. And I think this is where, if you're looking at working with people with disabilities as an organization, as an entity, what can we do? What kind of values we could inculcate in our workers, in our leadership, and also in terms of how do we care for these people who are in our setting. So the 4 values are respect, responsibility, restoration, and reintegration. This is not new. Most writers and researchers, famous writers and researchers, have already highlighted these values that are part of restorative justice. I just found it in a different context when I did my research on business ethics and leadership. So really then the principles, so those are the values. And when we look at the principles really is focusing on the harm and the impact on the different stakeholders. What are the obligations? How do we create an inclusive collaborative process? I think that is really the key, and it's quite relevant to our topic. And how do we put right the wrongs, right? So in terms of the speaker before me, Najma, and he comes from a community that is looking at some of these issues. How do we then come in to address those issues, and do we put the things right again? So again, within the institution, so these are my suggestions, and I will share a little bit about what I did when I was a probation officer, but really in an institutional setting, when we are looking at people who need a little bit more help because they are special, they have special needs, they have certain issues that we can help them with, and we can't give them the same standards as a lay person, then what do we do, right? Can we figure out if something were to go wrong? Can we focus more on making amends as an institution that is working with this group, and also within that group itself, within the community itself, instead of looking at it as all about trying to punish someone instead of punishing? Let's look at it from making amends. Can we look at it in terms of how justice can be served? Can we really try to establish conformance? So yes, not all of us have got the same strengths, the same ability. Obviously, in this gathering, we are all very, very different as well, in the way that we speak and the way that we talk, our culture, the color of our skin, and I'm wearing the hijab and all that. Yeah. So really, how do we establish a common ground, right? So it is not about just telling these people, yes, you're special because you're disabled, and we give them a special status. It's not only about that. It is also about bringing them back to the larger community, because they need to be part of our community, right? They cannot be isolated. They cannot be in their own community being different. Yeah, and building relationship as well as having a consensus in terms of the values that we want to have this organization going for. I think that is another key aspect. So this is within an institutional setting. If you're working in a school setting where we have children or young people with disabilities, and how do we include them maybe in sporty events? How do we include them when we are looking at managing, their discussions and their talks, getting them into schools, and all that. So moving on, I just wanted to show you an example of what we did here in Singapore when we worked with high-risk offenders. So the first case earlier, obviously, the case was one of a voluntary manslaughter, but it was not a high-risk case because the young person was very good. He was socially quite good, right? But we do have very high-risk cases who should technically be in prison because they are on drugs, or they are running away, or they're cutting themselves, or they're abusing alcohol. But we do not want to send them to prison. We place them in an institution like a hostel. So within the hostel setting, what we tried to do is to see how can we bring these values alive. We wanted the young people in this institution to experience restorative justice. So it's not just about having a nice welcome, code of conduct hanging in front of the building to say that we are restorative and we do these values and all that. We wanted the young people to feel it, to experience it. So we asked the young people, how can you feel restoration? How can you feel being respected? What is reintegration and what is responsibility? And we did this by using the FAIR process, the dialogue, the social discipline window, and all that. Obviously, I am coming from the criminal justice perspective, but I felt that some of this, values that we are trying to inculcate, if you're trying to incorporate in an institution, in a school setting, we need to be able to get the people who are experiencing it understand that these values are happening. So it's not just us practitioners, saying that we are restorative, but when we do restorative work, can our beneficiaries or the people that we are working with feel it? How do they see it, right? Can they experience it? Can they explain that this is happening to me within the institutional setting? So moving on, just two more slides. I would like to maybe highlight that whole aspect. Obviously, in this context, I'm putting the responsibility onto us. We are the ones with the knowledge, and what can we do as a community to bring this knowledge forward. So accountability has to be there. I think this inaugural first attempt to do this symposium and this webinar is excellent. It's something that we should carry on. We come from different parts of the world, literally, but we are able to still connect. I think building that relationship so that we could come up with something solid and concrete that we could implement and make sure that this group of people that we are looking at, that the people with disabilities can feel protected and included. So the processes is something that we need to be very clear. We need to be able to measure the outcome. As I said, we can have 10 processes, we can have 10 KPIs, but if our people, that we are working with cannot feel it, then there's no point, right? We can say that we are very successful, but there's no outcome in that context. And obviously the environment itself has to be restorative. So this is something that we tried to do when we were working with high-risk offenders within the institution itself. An example of this would be a lot of the high-risk cases were isolated. When they misbehave, we have a segregation room, we place them alone, get them to reflect. We realize that that's not going to work. It's better for them to be in a group with others so that they can support one another and prevent each other from getting into trouble. So the idea at the end is that whatever journey that we are taking, the journey begins with a single step. So this is something that comes from Asia, and we use this quite a bit, and we think that we can all take these little baby steps, to move towards the direction and the end outcome that we want. So with that, I thank you for listening. And I appreciate, if you have any questions and all that, please feel free to ask. I hope I was clear. My English could be quite different, right? Yeah, so with that, thank you so much.
Encantada em ouvi-los.
We are really delighted to listen to you all.
Muito obrigada.
And I thank you so much, Tariq, Marcelo, Nadima, Hazwana, for your brilliant contributions. We don't have a lot of time to go deeper in our discussion because we don't have a lot of time in the event itself. We have to move on to the next panel, but we are really grateful to you, your contributions. Well, now we're going to the next panel, people with disabilities, equality, dignity, and autonomy. In the first moment, we're going to listen to the lawyer and legal consultant, who is a partner of Suazi Bechara Storto Reicher Figueiredo Lopes Advogados, Stella Reicher. In the second moment, we're going to listen to the senior researcher and advocate, Disability Rights Division, Carlos Rios Espinosa. And then after him, the specialist in inclusive education in the agency, United States Agency for International Development, George Josa. And lastly, the executive director of AS Down, Monica Alexandra Cortes Aviles. So we hand the floor now to Stella. Good morning, almost good afternoon to you all. A pleasure to be with you to share a little bit of my knowledge. I'm a white woman. My hair is in the height of my shoulders. I'm seated in a room with earphones and a white wall in the background. I brought to you a presentation to help guide our talk. Let me see if I can share it with you. And then we can have a little chat. Let's see if you can see my presentation now. Not yet, Stella. Right, let's wait a little bit. If it takes too long, I can speak without the presentation. Yeah, the image is frozen here to me.
No?
Nothing? Well, let me go back. I will have my talk without presentation of slides. Just a little second. Well, I'm just going to show you my camera and I will speak to you without the slides. What I would like to mention, and I imagine that you have seen this week a very interesting news regarding the situation of a Ministry of Energy of Israel, that she was not able to enter the event, the UN convention that discussed climate change. She was not able to participate. And why am I mentioning this? Because Karine Larara, she's a lawyer. She is a person with disability. She used the wheelchair. And in the UN event, she could not enter the first day of the event. And why is it interesting to think about this episode, what this episode represented, and how we have dealt with topics related to the rights of persons with disabilities. Specifically, her case gained repercussion in the media, of course, especially because she's a public person. But how many persons with disabilities face a similar situation to what she faced, to have their rights violated, to have their access restricted, and not only in the physical aspect, but as Nadia said, in terms of communication, when you talk about the deaf and blind people. So we need to talk about this. I don't know if you have this data, but I like to talk. I like to work with data because it provides a dimension of what we are talking about. So approximately, and this data comes from the report that was published by the UN, approximately 46% of people over 6 years old are people with disabilities, people that somehow have a condition of disability. 1 in every 5 women may somehow, at some point, experience a condition of disability in their lives. Each 10 children, 1 has disabilities. When 1 million of people with disabilities around the world, 80% of them live in developing countries. So we really need to talk about this. When you bring the topic of restorative justice related to the topic of the people with disabilities, there are many interfaces, and we need to make it clear who is our public, who are the persons with disabilities. Within this context, I would like to mention to you that within the International System for Protection of Human Rights, as some colleagues mentioned, we have the convention, International Convention, Human Rights Treaty specific about people with disabilities. And I make this comment with my students, which is something interesting. Within the UN system, we started having human rights treaties since 1948. First, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and then the Prevention for Genocide Crime as a result of World War II. In 1965, the Convention of Elimination of all types of racial discrimination. We know that in the 60s, there was a huge movement regarding the fight, the civil rights fight. And then later, there were other treaties regarding economic rights, and then the Cold War times. So there were 2 blocks. There were 2 documents because of this. In the 70s, we had the Convention of Women. In the 80s, we had the Convention Against Torture. So it is a period that we stopped the dictatorial regimes, theoretically. In the 90s, we had the Migrant Workers Convention. And only in 2006, within the UN system, we had the Convention on the Persons with Disabilities. When we talk about this topic, we think why there should be a specific document. Why there would be a specific international treaty to talk about persons with disabilities? Because all of these things that existed did not include these people. There was a whole protection system created, but the disabled people were still invisible. How can we talk about justice, equity, and equality of rights to a public who still is not visible to the international system? And within this context, and we can start understanding this public. When we talk about disabilities, disability is an element of human diversity. As well as people have their own characteristics, the disability is one more element of this diversity. A very important point to highlight here is when we look at all the other international protection documents, we see that the disability is a cross-cutting topic. Other topics that bring vulnerability situations to people. For example, if I have a person who is an elderly person and this person has a disability, I have here two layers of vulnerability that are overlapping. The same way when we look at other situations, the gender issues, the ethnical origin, the gender identity, sexual orientation. So why is it important to talk about this? Because this is the public we are talking about. The people with disability are not a homogeneous public. They are people who have different situations, they need different types of demands and needs. When we look at this within the perspective of restorative justice, all of this has to be taken into account. So how can we do the restorative justice without looking at the specificities? Of course, we work on the perspective of acknowledging the collectiveness, the community, the equality within this group. However, it is important for us to understand that there are differences, and these people have to be respected in their differences. So I'm bringing just a little bit of this panorama to mention that with the UN Convention in Brazil, this convention has the status of constitutional norm, which means that as if we had this treaty document and we had included it in our constitution. So this is how important this document is in the Brazilian territory. This convention brings a paradigm shift that is really important for us to mention here, make it more clear, and talk a lot more about it. There is a paradigm shift that this convention brings, and we leave this concept of a medical model in a charity model.
And we had this very existentialist, pity-based sort of assistance model, and then we come into a medical model in which you see disabilities as something to be cured. That is, people with disabilities or people who needed to be cured, normalized. That was the medical models paradigm. And with the UN Convention, we advance a little bit more to another model, to another moment.
Olha para as pessoas com deficiência dentro de uma
A
ótica
moment
social.
in which we look at people with disabilities inside a logic of human rights. So when we're talking about people with disabilities, we stop looking at people understanding that they have a problem, and we try to understand that the issue is in an equation which mixes the condition of a given person versus their surroundings. Therefore, the more in which I have a context in which things are inclusive, accessible, the harder it is for me to perceive any limitations this person might have due to their conditions. So, to bring an example, when we talk about physical disabilities, let's say someone who's in a wheelchair, an easy to visualize example. If I have a building with no access ramp and with stairs in front of it, people won't be able to come in. The same applies for other situations. So if I have a person who has a visual disability, if I can't have them have availability for materials, maybe like a software that does reading, braille, we need to have elements to so that people can participate in life with equality. And what we also change in this paradigm is having a point of view that's a lot more related to the issue of rights. So people with disabilities are subjects of rights. So we're not talking about people doing things for other people. They're entitled to their rights. That means If you have the rights, you have the right to demand this from other people, from states, from private people. So when school is not accessible, when education is not inclusive, when education isn't for everyone, then I have a problem and I have the right to demand for things to be inclusive. If health services aren't accessible, if when I need some medical support, I don't have on the other side someone who is able to communicate with me, let's say through sign language, if that's the way I communicate, then I'll have a problem, I'll have a limit imposed on me. If there's not someone on the other side that understands that to have a dialogue with someone who has an intellectual disability, I need to respect their time, that I need to use a specific kind of language, maybe an easier kind of language. Once again, I'm not enabling them to access the rights that they have. Therefore, inside the concept of disability, what does this convention say? That disability is a concept that is constantly evolving and that results from interactions between persons with disability and the barriers that are created due to attitudes and environments that impede these people from interacting with the world. So this is something very important for us not to forget. We can't work on the rights of people without being very clear about this. And then very conceptually, it's interesting for us to talk a little bit about this. What is this group made of? Persons with disability. Who is this population? The UN Convention has a definition. Persons with disabilities are those persons who have long-term impediments that whose natures are physical, mental, sensorial, or intellectual, which with this interaction with barriers may harm their participation with society. Our inclusion law that was based on this UN convention has a very similar concept. So when we're talking about an impediment from a sensorial or physical nature, sometimes it's easier for us to understand. So inside sensorial impediments, we have people who are deaf, people who are blind, people who are deaf and blind. This is all inside sensorial disabilities.
Eu acho que a gente tem ponto bem importante que eu gostaria de
When
esclarecer.
I talk about mental and intellectual, that's something else that's very important to clear up. Why is it that we have these two expressions in the convention? Because intellectual deficiency is associated to an idea of a cognitive deficit, which should not be confused with mental disabilities or psychosocial disabilities, which are in their turn associated to health conditions, mental health conditions. Why is it I thought that it was important to talk about this? Because that's another public that's been very forgotten. When we're dealing with the rights of persons with disability, they're oftentimes a public that suffers vulnerabilities inside vulnerabilities, those people who have psychosocial diseases. These are specificities that we must look at. When we're working with restorative justice in any environment, we need to be very aware. We need to understand this context in which persons with disability are inserted, who they are. And so continuing, what did I want to share with you? When we have this model, we have a few principles which are very important, and we must always look at this when we're working. These principles are also reflected in the convention. So the idea of inclusion, the idea of non-discrimination, the idea of participation, of respect to difference and diversity, respect for inherent dignity, accessibility, and equality of opportunities. So I think generally speaking, when we're talking about respect to dignity, what are we saying? That all persons with disabilities, independently of the condition that they might have, what functional limits they might have, everyone needs to be respected as free human beings, autonomous human beings, as people who are able to do to make their own decisions. When we're talking about respect for difference and acceptance of persons of disability as a part of human diversity, this means, once again, accepting disability as an element, as a characteristic of human existence. Equality of opportunities brings us this perspective in which we realize that we need to offer legal treatments in certain situations that are diverse so that we may allow equality. So we can talk about affirmative action, for instance. Our legislation authorizes that we might have mechanisms to enable people's inclusion when they are persons with disability, for instance. So
ela precisa ser, em algumas situações, a deficiência
in
precisa
certain
ser.
situations, disabilities might need to be highlighted so that we can promote equality. What do we mean by highlighted? We might adopt measures of affirmative action, for instance, so that persons with disabilities can reach, like in Brazil, we have affirmative action quotas for the labor market. So companies with over 100 employees need to hire persons with disability. So that's a stimulus for people with disability to get into the labor market. So the idea of going against discrimination brings us the idea that we need to impose punitive measures when we see situations where there are violations of the rights of persons with disabilities, when we see situations in which these people are discriminated because of their disabilities. So this is a discussion that's very current in Brazil in relation to Decree 10,502, which talked about inclusive education. So in Brazil, we had a policy for special education in the perspective of inclusive education. This decree has a whole grammar of human rights, but if you read it carefully, you see that a lot what has been proposed there is segregation. It's a proposal to segregate students with disabilities from students without disabilities. So this goes against this principle. Goes beyond. This goes completely the opposite direction from non-discrimination. What about full and effective participation of persons with disability in society? Well, I think this happens in a variety of different levels. At the very limit, when we stop and think, how many representatives with disabilities do we have in parliament? How many persons with disabilities have access to large decisions in relation to the constructions of public policies, in relation to the development of legislation? How many persons with disabilities and their families and organizations have participation in this process of construction of legislation and public policies? We must always have this in mind when we're talking about the rights of persons with disabilities. The convention will also talk about equality between men and women. They also will have some specific points about the development of the abilities of children, the rights for boys and girls to develop, accessibility. And accessibility in this convention, it comes in as a right, but it's also a guarantee. It's a principle, it's a guarantee because it is the channel through which we might guarantee accessibility. And if we don't guarantee accessibility, we harm a lot of other rights. And at the very heart of the convention, and I'm coming into the final points of my contribution, we have an article which is essential in the convention called, well, that deals with equal recognition in the law. This article says that persons with disability have the right to be recognized anywhere as people in relation to the law. What does this mean? That they have their own rights. They're the holders of their own rights. In the legal framework, this is the legal personality. They have the power to be holders of legal rights. The convention also talks about the legal capacity of persons with disabilities. What is that? The capacity to exercise their rights, because it's not enough for me to just have a right if I can't exercise it.
De ter direitos e de exercer direitos em igualdade.
The capacity of exercising my rights in an equal condition to other people. And in this sense, states need to provide support when necessary so that people can exercise their rights. So, of course, our theme is just not talking about the Brazilian inclusion law, but I think it's interesting to mention to you that in this perspective of human rights, the Brazilian inclusion law made it very clear that having a deficiency does not affect a person's capacity to marry, to have children, to make a family, to choose where they want to live, with whom they want to live, if they want to adopt someone, if they want to have the guard of their children. None of this is any problem because
ela limitava.
our previous legislation, believe it or not, it was not the case. So people with disabilities, this affected directly, especially those people who are intellectually and psychosocially disabled. They weren't considered as being holders of their full rights. And this changed. So here in Brazil, we already have clarity that these rights should be ensured. The norm makes it very clear. So I like to ask, and when I listened to the speeches in the previous panel, and I think Carlos, Josh, and Monica will also complement this. Well, why is it that if we have so many legal provisions, the rights of people with disabilities are still such a huge challenge? There's a person who is participating here today. Teresa had a very important question talking about the situations in which people with disabilities live on the day-to-day. Very embarrassing situations. We talk a lot about inclusion, but what kind of inclusion? What does this inclusion mean? Why is it that this isn't happening if we have the law? What are the barriers that are in place? What are the challenges for this to happen? So I think one important point is that persons with disability are still seen in various spaces as persons who cannot participate fully in society. And this is very complicated. This is absurd. This is terrible. This is full-on discrimination. This perception sometimes is a little bit concealed, sometimes it's explicit, but these situations are the kind of situations that when we actually face them, that's when we actually understand that there's something that's deeply rooted in our society about how persons with disability are seen.
Deficiência como sujeitos de
This
direito.
lack of knowledge for persons with disabilities as people with rights, discussions that we see on day to day. I work a lot with the issue of rights of people with intellectual disabilities. Something as simple as opening a bank account. Oftentimes they might have a limit to opening their own bank account, or maybe getting something signed at the notary. Why? Why would this still be a problem? So I'd also like to comment that our society normalizes. It's a society that creates models, that creates standards, and oftentimes it ignores diversity. And sometimes this issue of the imposition of models, maybe if society doesn't recognize disability as an element of diversity, this makes it so that oftentimes persons with disability don't see themselves in this model. And this brings about a series of issues. When we talk about young people with disabilities, the difficulties that young people with disabilities face, when we talk about puberty, when we talk about dating, when we talk about relating to other people, this is a very ableist point of view. So if you have this standard, you might think that these people aren't good enough. So how do we talk about this? We must talk about this prejudice. In relation to people with intellectual disability, there's a very important point, which is this idea of treating them as children, looking at a person with intellectual disability and not see them as adults. It's this perception that they might always need to be protected. We must be careful with these kinds of points of view because these are segregating points of view. These points of view exclude other people. So to close up my speech, I'm bringing more thoughts than answers here.
Mais sobre algumas coisas, né? A gente precisa falar
I think
mais.
we need to talk more about diversity. We need to talk more about what discrimination is. We must understand that people are unique. We must understand that their characteristics are part of human diversity, that discrimination based on disabilities is a crime, and that we must be very aware about segregating measures that might cause disproportionate damage to persons with disability. During the pandemic, I had the opportunity to talk about this in another event, and we can't deny that persons with disability suffered disproportionate damage. And how do we deal with this? Who's looking at this? We must talk more about the exercise of legal capacity, how we can ensure that persons with disabilities make their own choices, exercise their wills, and not have their desires be replaced by the desires of others. We need to talk about intersectionality, these various layers that makes it so that persons with disability live multiple discriminations. We must really look in depth at this point, and we must talk more about ableism. It's time more than ever for us to work in order to combat discourses, programs, proposals, and projects which don't recognize persons with disability with their specificities, with their needs, with their desires. I'm available, and I hope I contributed a little bit to our conversation today. Thank you.
Passamos a palavra ao Carlos.
I'd like to hand the floor to Carlos. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Carlos Rios. I work for Human Rights Watch. I'm a man with a fair skin. I'm wearing glasses. I'm a person with disabilities. I use a wheelchair. Behind me, you can see library, some books. I'm wearing blue shirt. I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to talk about this topic, which is really important, which is the restorative justice, people with disabilities. I think that we need to have this topic in a broader perspective. I would talk about restorative justice in the context of criminal law. And something that we need to be aware of is when we talk about restorative justice and people with disabilities and criminal law, is that the people with disabilities, they must have the access to justice with equality, such just as anybody else.
Consciência de
It's
que
important for us to have the knowledge that people with disabilities, they can participate in the legal processes with an equality of circumstances, just like other people. In the Latin American context and the world in general, we have seen institutions that are against the idea that people with disabilities are equal. For example, with the idea that they do not have the possibility to defend themselves in a criminal context, and they have to have a special procedure so that instead of penalties or criminal sanctions, they could have the security measures. This is a big problem because the security measures, they are based in personal circumstances of the person. Very frequently, we consider that the people cannot suffer a penalty or something like this, and because of this, the security measures are imposed. The security measures, have been invented by the fascist Italian code that had a perspective to defend the society of people that were considered to be dangerous. So people with disabilities were considered like that, especially people who had psychosocial disabilities or intellectual disabilities. They were considered to be dangerous and they therefore should be controlled. And it affects in the access that these people with disabilities have to the rightful process. And something important that we need to remember when we talk about restorative justice on other alternatives to the criminal process is that first, we need to be aware that the first guarantee of any person in a criminal context, in the criminal law, is to have the possibility to defend him or herself against accusations. Also, if a person participates in the character of a victim, this person has the right to participate and to have the reparation of the damage. So this is important. It is important because when we talk about restorative justice or alternative measures for conflict resolution, we need to be aware that the criminal law has an asymmetric position among participants. It's not the same thing to have a social conflict that is not criminal. It is a context in which a person is accused of a certain crime. And in that sense, we need to have the awareness that it can happen. So it is an asymmetry of power between the people who are participating, among the people who are participating. Another thing that we need to reflect is how to implement mechanisms of restorative justice and alternatives for conflict resolution is to understand that we need to have the possibility to have a process with all the guarantees that are in the international law, in the human rights context. We have seen in Latin American countries that if you have a great confidence in these new mechanisms, I think it's very important because we need to look for new paths for conflict resolutions. And many times the criminal justice is not enough to make amends on the social tissue that is disconnected to conflicts or crimes. So it's difficult many times to determine who is the offender or the one who is the victim. There are conflicts that it's hard to say who is the one to be accountable for. And in that sense, the restorative justice is very good. But we need to be careful because I insist in this idea that there can be a disparity among the participants. For the persons with disabilities, it is very true. It is more true than to people without disabilities, because the system for participation of the persons with disabilities in the context of criminal law is structurally a problem, especially because they do not have the same guarantees that other people have to defend themselves. In many countries of Latin America, such as Argentina and Mexico, even Brazil, I think people do not have the same guarantees. Many times people say people who have psychosocial disabilities, people say that they will open a special procedure or a special process for that person. And it is problematic because a person with disabilities, as any other person, has the right to be considered innocent and be accused and to defend him or herself with the same guarantees of any other person. And for this, if somebody starts to talk about mechanisms of justice, of alternative justice or restorative justice, without having the minimal guarantees of participation in criminal justice, in normal criminal justice, which is supposed to be for all, it can be something problematic because one of the guarantees that we have precisely in the system to be able to have the restorative justice to be adjusted is that we do not have a criminal process that guarantee the same rights. So the precondition of effectiveness of the restorative justice and alternative options for conflict resolution is a justice that works in the traditional level. So we have the necessary guarantees to adjust this, but to do so, we must be aware of the guarantees that establish the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities, for these people to be able to participate in equal conditions compared to the other people in the judicial processes, in the legal processes. I'm talking about Article 13 of the Convention of the Persons with Disabilities that says that these persons, they have the right to participate in equal conditions of compared to other people in legal processes. And for this, sometimes they need some measures, some accommodations, procedural accommodations and measures for them to participate effectively in the different procedures, legal procedures. This has to do with the possibility of understanding what is happening in the procedure. When we have a process of restorative justice, it is necessary to guarantee the procedural accommodations, and it can be done as well. However, people that are responsible to have committed a crime or an offense, or a victim of an offense. For this, it is necessary for us to be able to have better conversations with the people who will participate to understand the requirements. It doesn't mean that it is a special procedure. It is not a special procedure. It is not a procedure that is the same, or it should be the same procedure with the necessary accommodations to make it accessible for the persons with disabilities. I think it is very important, and I would like to mention an example that we have in Mexico. And Mexico, as other countries of Latin America, is now involved in a process of reform in the judiciary branch, be able to accommodate the highest principles of human rights, internationally speaking. And it includes the possibility to have the accommodations, the procedural accommodations and adjustments for the people with disabilities can effectively participate. So we have a specific provision, a specific article in the National Code for Criminal Procedures that refers to the need of having these procedures, these specific procedural accommodations. it also includes two other things: having two types of alternative justice or alternatives for the resolution of conflicts. The first one is the possibility to have conciliations and a way to have mediations, as we call it here. It means that the facilitator, the specific facilitator, has to mediate the problem in a way that the persons can be appropriated to the conflict and search for solutions to get out of the conflict. For this, it is necessary to have preparatory meetings in restorative panels to consider the accessibility measures that are necessary for the people who have any type of the disability can participate effectively. For example, by the participation of the participation of a sign language interpreter, and also having a personal assistant that can explain the meaning of the process and what is being said specifically in the restorative panel. Just to finish my talk here, I could highlight the need of having the awareness that in criminal law, unavoidably, we have the a disparity of the participants, and this can represent jeopardy for the people with disabilities. So we need to be careful in the participation of the implementation of procedural accommodations for the fact that these people can guarantee equality as any other people in these processes. So I'd like to thank you again for the invitation, and I will pay attention to the questions if there are any. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Now we open the floor to Josh Josa.
Hello, everyone. I'm Josh Josa, and I work for the U.S. Agency for International Development, but I'm here today in a different capacity. I want to thank everyone for allowing me to be with you. It's very much an honor to talk about the connection between education and restorative justice. So I'm wearing a plaid shirt. I'm a white man in his mid-30s. My knowledge and experience has mostly been focused in the educational domains, but I will touch a little bit on restorative justice, but we'll talk a little bit more in terms of education and how that can contribute to restorative justice outcomes. First, I want to begin by presenting you with a question about societies and their relationship that's of people with difference and justice, focusing on centering a social model of disability and really focusing on the experience of the most marginalized so that they can live in an independent, autonomous, dignified, and equal way. In education, it's really the foundational tool for the advancement of equity and inclusion for all individuals, regardless of whether they have a disability or other identities, LGBTQIA, male, female, race, doesn't matter, and transform society through education in an evidence-based way that takes into consideration individual identities and provides an opportunity that's significant for language acquisition and building the skills such as reading, writing, literacy, numeracy, as well as social and emotional skills. If individuals have good foundations in literacy, numeracy, and those social emotional skills, then they and the society at large are more likely not only to have better employment outcomes, but also higher level understanding, empathy, and justice. Different educational systems around the world, some are more advanced than others, some still have a ways to go in being equitable and inclusive. But by way of some history, others have spoken to this, but there's been a stigma repeatedly that people with disabilities aren't sent to public schools or placed in completely segregated schools from people without disabilities. Today, we have the Convention on Rights of People with Disabilities in hand, and many countries have started to change their legal frameworks to be more inclusive and more open to people with disabilities. We also are seeing more and more individuals pushing to ensure that education is what's happening in education is a reality, and more people with disabilities are going to schools, going through higher education, and getting equitable employment. All of those things are then contributing to better social emotional learning for individuals and having huge impacts for effective restorative justice for those populations because of their social emotional skills and the ability to be self-aware and reflective, and then see in other people their perspectives, their experiences, and applying that, which is a very important skill for them to have. But thinking more big picture in terms of the impacts of education, it's creating a cultural shift based on the educational system that's constructed and designed to meet the needs of all students, both students with disabilities and those without disabilities. Quite often, you have to take a twin track approach, where in one track, you're ensuring that the system has the skills, knowledge, and resources needed to meet all people's needs in a variety of diverse learning ways, training all teachers to understand the principles of universal design for learning, ensuring that the teachers are able to look across the student population that they have, those diverse learners, and within those classrooms, ensuring that their individual specific needs within their group are met. So that's universal design for learning, which is based on a framework developed by CAST, an organization that developed the framework that's evidence-based and aims to optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights about how humans learn, which includes recognition that providing instruction in multiple ways to students, presenting information, whether it be through spoken, signed, tactile language, as well as the written form, and allowing multiple methods of active expression for the individual, whether it be through drawing, written word, spoken word. If we do all of those things, then we have a better chance to have students who are intentionally motivated and have the resources they need to be able to set their own path to move forward. And that ties to higher employment outcomes, to higher social emotional skills, and actually the ability to be more perceptive in interactions with others, which improves outcomes for restorative justice. So that's universal design for education and how we can ensure that all teachers are equipped with the skills, knowledge, and resources to meet the needs of a variety of students in their classrooms. The second track is attention to specific individuals' needs. Understanding that teaching practice will vary, but we still need to focus on the individual students because historically, that's been a huge gap in the system. And if we actually look at their individual specific needs, for example, a student who is blind might need Braille accommodation. Those deaf and hard of hearing students need sign language. Those with intellectual disabilities might need additional time and attention. So meeting each of their individual needs, such as deaf students who may need to go to a school where they have direct access to a teacher in their native language, not based on an interpreter, which will further inhibit their ability to access their education. So taking a step back from that universal design in education and thinking about questions in context of restorative justice and using that universal design for education model and thinking about how that works and how we can take that single step further into using that framework to build relationships between people with disabilities and without disabilities. Because in education, we can do that. We're not quite there yet. But one possible way of making that work is when we're designing a transformation of any system, whether it's the educational system or the criminal justice system, how do we center the transformation around the social model, around the experience of the most marginalized, such as people with disabilities? And the way we might do that is if, like as Najma Johnson spoke to earlier this morning about her experience as a deaf person and what barriers deaf and deafblind people might experience living in that phonocentric and visual-centric world, those comments, how different the world might be if a blind person was centered and everyone else from birth knew how to sign, knew how to present in Braille, knew how to tactilely sign. How would the world be so different for the deaf-blind person as a result of the changed experience if that was centered? Rather than having the hearing-sighted centric approach, making those connections would allow individuals to connect differently and make the world a different place. I know earlier Stella had mentioned in her comments that as people get older and older, more people join the disability family. And that's true. People get older and they become disabled. Why haven't we presented the skills, knowledge, and ability to individuals to actually navigate later in life, earlier in their education? To be more blunt, why aren't we teaching younger kids in school how to sign, how to prepare Braille, how to understand the principles of universal design in learning to apply in their different later life? Because they're eventually going to need those skills as they engage with people of difference. They need those skills now in their education so that they can make the world a different place and impact individuals' lives and ability to present in the world and really create different restorative justice outcomes. I really want to leave everyone with that question again that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. In what ways may society bridge the difference between people of difference if we center and shift systems such as education and justice around the social model of disability and other intersectional experiences of the most marginalized among us so that they may have independent, autonomous dignified and equitable lives. Thank you again for allowing me to participate in this seminar and learn with you today.
Muito grata por tê-lo aqui hoje.
Thank you so much for being here. And now we immediately open the floor to Monica.
Okay, hello. Hello for everyone. My name is Monica Cortez from Colombia, and I have a striped black hair. I wear in this moment purple glasses, a black blouse, and a white jacket with gray lines for all. This is my description. A cordial greeting for all here. Thanks a lot to the organizers, especially to the Joao Clemente Institution for making visible in all the spaces the reality of people with intellectual disabilities. The reason why I am here on this panel has to do with the work that I have been carrying out for 10 years, promoting the legislative transformation toward the full recognition of the legal capacity for the persons with disability here in Colombia, and the harmonization with the Article 12. Only 2 years ago, we had the figure of the interdiction that applied to the person with disabilities that were considered without the ability to reason, and that today has been removed from the legal framework, and the full legal capacity of all persons with disability is recognized. So this changed a lot of things. As a mother of a person with intellectual disability, and as an activist for the implementation of the CRPD, I believe that this space is worth talking about the recognition of legal capacity, and its application is the like of measures related to restorative justice proposal in the criminal field, and also in the different spaces in which all persons with disabilities have the right to be part. I'm sure in my presentation I will take elements that Carlos and Estela have mentioned, but keeping in mind that we are in the change towards the fulfillment of these requirements here in Colombia. As Estela has explained, the CRPD marks a milestone in the last decade with respect to what the new paradigm of the social model and rights of all persons with disability means. The countries of the region are advancing in this topic, for example, Colombia, Peru, Costa Rica, but there are issues that are still under analysis and crossed by that medical model, the beliefs that some person couldn't decide about their lives because it will depend on the particular characteristics of the person with disability, that we can talk about certain rights and it's not. The rights are for everyone without exceptions, such as this right to express their will and preference in environments where they have to face judicial acts. Article 12 and 13 in of the CRPD call on all those in charge of the judicial operation to also change toward this new paradigm of recognition of persons with disability as subjects with voice and with the possibility of expressing their will. With this transformation, we find today that all persons with disabilities can testify in a trial as a witness, file a complaint, give their opinion in the face of acts that involve them, with the necessary support and adjustments to be able to access. Restorative justice programs are based on the belief that parties to a conflict must be actively involved in resolving and mitigating its negative consequence. Then, persons with disability also have the right to make mistakes, and that they can also recognize their actions, the consequence, and receive supports to understand what has happened. It has been the idea that persons with disability cannot make mistakes or commit crimes. Sometimes they they have also acted by not understanding which occurred. Their anger or reaction against another person, we know also that sometimes they have been victims of abuse, mockery or bullying at the schools, at the work. And this is where restorative justice becomes very important, to understand the situation and be able to give them the necessary support. The methodology used in restorative justice promotes tolerance and inclusion and builds respect for diversity by generating responsible communities practices. In the case of persons with disability, two things happened. The first was that their declaration of absolute incapable, like 2 years ago here in Colombia, made that the voice of person will not be taken into account, and many times it had been used by people who took advantage of their condition to commit crimes, and the measures were mixed with the declaration of inimputability. The second situation that happened was that due to the declaration of non-inimputability, the real criminal used the figure under a medical opinion and managed to get rid of criminal sanction using measures of which they shouldn't have. Therefore, having today the full recognition of legal capacity opens the possibility of establishing exactly without the right to confusions, measures that guarantee that person with disability is heard and that it received the necessary support to clarify the reason that led it to act. If it was sent by someone, or in the case of intellectual disability person, if they reacted for some circumstances that provoked violent behavior. An strategy that leads that person with disability that committed the crime as well as the victim to understand what happened, the reason. We have case, for example, with person with intellectual disability, which was used by drugs dealers to deliver merchandise. They didn't notice that anguish of the young man who didn't understand that he had done wrong, he was arrested and taken to prison without giving him opportunity to be heard, nor to have the means to explain what was happening. This week in Singapore, a person with intellectual disability who has not been given the necessary guarantees to understand what has happened will be punished with the death penalty. For all the movement that promote the rights of persons with disability, this is really a wrong way to act in the justice system. Access to the justice has been recognized as a right for anyone, with the aim also to protecting human dignity. We have different manifestations. The right to be heard and to have adequate judicial or extrajudicial mechanisms for that purpose. The right to have the appropriate tools for the settlements of disputes and punishment of offenses. The right to an effective remedy for the protection of fundamental rights. The right to defense, the right to an independent and impartial tribunal, the right to obtain a response in a reasonable period, on time and in accordance with the law, as well as the right to be provision of the plan are complied with. Carlos mentioned the figure of the judicial facilitator. I know that in Mexico, they have this figure. So we consider that is the best way to support person with disability in some judicial issues. We have another adjustment to the procedure. For example, the United Nations defined procedural adjustment as all the modification and necessary and appropriate adaptation in the context of access to justice when required in a given case to ensure equal participation of persons with disabilities with the others. For example, sign language interpreter, braille documents or warranty to use the technology, provide information to the person with disability in plain language. It's important to know directly with the person with disability if in all the legal acts Also, for example, in the adjustments to the procedures, decrease, for example, the solemnity in the interaction, allow the accompaniment of someone if your trust if required, variation in question techniques, use simple language, allow, for example, to make situation more flexible, such as the deaf person not having handcuffs, in order to the person can use the sign language, ensure physical accessibility, for example, and other communication supports, of course. In conclusion, the most important thing is to establish a new vision about persons with disabilities in relation to the rights to access to the justice and to have the necessary support and adjustments, breaking down any barriers that prevent progress in the right to know information and to be provided with guarantees such as those completed in restorative justice application process. As a complement, you can review the recommendation made by the United Nations in the document called Principles and International Guidelines on Access to Justice for Individuals with Disabilities. Thank you very much for this space, and thank you, Estela, also to organize.
Muito agradecer. Stella, Carlos.
We'd like to thank very much Stella, Carlos, Jorge, all of you. We had some important issues to our reflections. We have a lot to rethink and implement so that we can guarantee the inclusion of persons with disabilities. Due to the time, we will not have time for questions, but tomorrow we will continue talking about the ongoing experiences, and this will be very enlightening. I'm sure that we have a lot to build together. So I'd like to thank you all, ladies and gentlemen who participated. Tomorrow we will start at 10 a.m. Brazil time and 8 a.m. Washington time. Thank you very much to you all for your presence.